A Sweetest Beginning is a holiday romance short story. You can get the ebook by signing up for the newsletter, link in the description below. The Sweetest Beginning by Christy Summers. Chapter 1. The old radiator in the Reading Nook offered a rhythmic, metallic clink as Paige Miller stepped through the door, a sound as familiar as her own heartbeat. A shiver, born of more than just the pre-dawn chill of Snowdrift Cove, traced a path down her spine. At the front of the bookstore, frost feathered the edges of the large front windows, transforming the view of the quiet, snow-dusted street into a pale watercolor painting in shades of white and gray. A few days before Christmas, the very air seemed to hold its breath, caught between the joyful anticipation of the holidays and the biting promise of a true New England winter. For Paige, it was a beautiful but lonely time of year. Inside, she moved with the purpose of long habit, the worn wooden floorboards creaking slightly under her boots. She flicked on the strings of fairy lights crisscrossing the ceiling, and their warm, honeyed glow softened the towering, shadow-filled bookshelves that rose toward the high ceilings. Worn armchairs sat in cozy corners, their faded floral patterns and indented cushions holding the memory of countless readers. The scent of old paper and aging cloth bindings, an aroma she'd loved since childhood, mingled with the sweet, spicy aroma of cinnamon sachets by the register. This bookstore wasn't just a business. It had been her mother's dream, her legacy, and now, Paige's sanctuary and her heaviest burden. She ran a hand along a row of spines, the familiar titles a source of contentment, yet their presence was also a constant, pressing reminder of what she could lose. After coaxing the ancient thermostat a few degrees higher, she focused on the day's activities. Christmas in Germany, the third installment of her ambitious Christmas Around the World event. She arranged a small platoon of nutcrackers on a side table, their painted grins and vacant eyes starkly cheerful against her own tight-lipped worry. She tucked sprigs of fragrant evergreen around a display of Grimm's fairy tales. Her own story, with its looming villains of debt and threats of foreclosure, felt far from a fairy tale right now. At her desk in the corner, she opened the laptop. Emails flooded the screen, with bold subject lines. Overdue notice. Final reminder. The words pulsed in time with the dull ache that had taken up residence behind her eyes. Her gaze slid to the framed photo next to the screen. Her mother, vibrant and smiling, standing in this very spot 10 years ago, a book held aloft like a trophy at the grand opening. Mom had made it look so easy, so joyful. This has to work. Paige pressed her fingertips to her temple, trying to massage away the tension. The flyers she'd hand-delivered to every shop in town, the meager budget she'd spent on social media ads, the sheer force of her will, it all had to be enough. And the weight of her mother's dream felt heavier and colder than the impending snowstorm the forecasters were predicting. The clanking radiator seemed to offer a word of encouragement as she slipped back into her thick wool coat. Her nose had been smelling the intoxicating aroma of yeast, sugar, and roasting coffee from next door since before she had stepped into her shop. It was an irresistible temptation. The Sweet Spot, Adam Emerson's new bakery, had only been open a few weeks, but its warmth and charm were already a town staple. Through his own large window, she could see him moving inside, a silhouette of focused energy. He was tall and broad-shouldered, yet he moved around his bakery with a smoothness and comfort that did not match his size. Adam looked up as the bell over his door jingled, and a smile instantly softened the tired lines around his eyes. He had a dusting of flour on his cheek that she resisted the urge to brush away. "Morning, Paige." "The usual?" "Morning, Adam." "Yes, please." Her eyes drank in the sight of the golden brown pastries, each one a small, perfect sculpture of flaky dough and sweet fillings. The whole place hummed with a hopeful energy that felt a world away from the quiet anxiety of her own shop. He passed her the steaming cup of black coffee, his knuckles brushing hers for a fleeting, warm moment that sent a little jolt up her arm. "Here," he said, and his voice was gentler than the tone one usually hears from a shopkeeper speaking to their customers. He slid a small white box across the gleaming counter. "On the house. I'm trying out a new spiced gingerbread muffin. I could use a second opinion." "Oh, Adam, you don't have to do that." Her protest was weak, her stomach already rumbling in loud anticipation. She lifted the lid, and a cloud of warmth and spice, ginger, cloves, cinnamon, and something uniquely comforting she couldn't name, rose to meet her. "It smells divine. Absolutely divine. Thank you." A genuine, sweet smile touched his lips, making him look younger. "I hope you like them. Let me know what you think." His question felt like it held more weight than just a query about a muffin, a hopeful curiosity in his gaze that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in a long time. Back in the Reading Nook, cradling the coffee and the gifted muffin, Paige felt a pang of something sharp and unwelcome. She understood more than most how Adam had taken a risk, a brave leap of faith, building something new from the ground up. His business was full of hope and the scent of fresh starts. While hers was an inheritance, a legacy, she was terrified of failing, of letting down the memory of her mother. She pushed the thought away, taking a tentative bite of the muffin. The taste was exquisite, a perfect balance of spice and sweetness that melted on her tongue. Warmth spread through her, and for a precious moment, the knot in her stomach eased its relentless grip. The bell over her own door jingled, announcing her first regular. "Mornin', lass." Captain Silas boomed, stomping snow from his boots with unnecessary vigor and filling the quiet space with his larger-than-life presence. "Ready to regale us with old tales from Deutschland, are we?" Reminds me of a Christmas I spent in Hamburg back in '78. Nearly got shanghaied by a crew of one-eyed herring fishermen after a misunderstanding over missing stolen bread. He winked slyly as he settled into his favorite armchair by the window. The cold wood groaned in protest. Soon after, Tom and Lily Henderson burst in, young newlyweds filled with youthful energy, together a whirlwind of infectious excitement.
"Paige,
the store looks amazing. So festive and thematic," Lily chirped, her eyes wide with admiration. "We are so ready for a German Christmas," her husband added, beaming. "Did you bring out the cuckoo clock? I love watching that old thing." Betty Higgins, the town's unofficial historian and columnist for the Snowdrift Cove Chronicle, entered more sedately, her presence immediately lowering the room's boisterous energy. Her sharp eyes scanned every detail, from the number of books on display to the sprigs of evergreen. Her pen and notebook already in hand. "Good morning, Paige dear. Quite the setup. Expecting a good crowd?" "I do hope so. It would be such a shame if all this effort went to waste." The question, layered with faux concern, hung in the air, heavy with Paige's unspoken hopes. Before she could think of a cheerful yet non-committal answer, her phone buzzed on the counter. The weather app flashed across the screen. "Winter storm warning. Significant accumulation expected. Travel not advised." Her heart sank with the sickening lurch of a falling elevator. Her carefully constructed hope for the day crumbled. She held the phone out to Captain Silas, her hand trembling slightly with disappointment. He squinted at it, his bushy white eyebrows furrowing.
"Pa."
"A bit of snow. Just a Tuesday in December for a Mainer. Scares off the tourists is all." "Oh, maybe we'll get a white Christmas." Lily clapped her hands together, oblivious to Paige's distress. Paige forced a smile that felt brittle enough to shatter. The knot in her stomach, which the muffin had soothed, was back, tighter than ever. Outside, the first delicate flakes of snow drifted past the window, each one a beautiful, terrifying threat to her mother's dream. The pre-dawn air inside the sweet spot was Adam's sanctuary. It was a world he'd built from scratch, spun from flour, sugar, and a desperate hope that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Outside, the early morning light was a weak gray, casting the quiet streets of Snowdrift Cove in shades of pewter and ice. But in here, the world was warm, golden, and alive with the aroma of his trade, the yeasty promise of rising dough, the dark, rich scent of freshly ground coffee, and the sweet, comforting aroma of melting butter. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled air of his old corner office in Portland, a life he'd shed like a coat that never quite fit. Some days, The ghost of that old life still whispered doubts in his ear, but most mornings, like this one, the joy of baking silenced it. A blast of heat washed over his face as he pulled open the heavy door of the commercial oven, the heart of his new little kingdom. The timer had just chimed, a triumphant little ding that cut through the soft Christmas carols playing on the small radio perched on the shelf. He slid a massive baking sheet out, the movement practiced and smooth, and set it on the cooling rack. A platoon of spiced gingerbread muffins, their dome tops a perfect deep brown, sat in neat rows, sending a cloud of fragrant steam into the air. Ginger, cloves, a hint of black pepper for warmth, and a secret touch of orange zest. It was a new recipe, a gamble. He nudged one with his finger, testing its spring. It felt right, but the real test would be the taste. Every new recipe was a small leap of faith. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. His life had been full of those little leaps lately. He ran a hand through his hair, realizing too late it was probably dusted with flour, and walked over to the small desk tucked into a corner by the storeroom. He flipped open the order book, its pages already filled with a cheerful scrawl of holiday requests. A dozen sugar cookies shaped like snowflakes for the library staff party. A black forest cake for someone's Christmas Eve dinner. And more orders were coming in by the day, filling up his calendar. A wave of profound relief washed over him. It was working. People were coming. They were ordering. They were enjoying what he made. The mountain of debt he'd taken on to make this dream a reality felt a little less like a mountain and more like a hill he could actually climb. This tiny bakery, his sweet spot in the world, might actually survive its first winter. As if summoned by the thought of winter, the lilting melody of silver bells on the radio was abruptly cut off by a flat, official-sounding tone. We interrupt this program for a special weather alert from the National Weather Service, a disembodied voice announced. A system moving into the region is expected to bring significant snow accumulation over the next 24 to 36 hours. Residents are advised to prepare for hazardous travel conditions. Just a weather alert, not a full-blown warning, but it planted a small seed of unease. A big snow was great for a cozy Christmas aesthetic, but it was terrible for foot traffic. He glanced out the large front window at the sky that was already the color of a dirty fleece blanket and made a mental note to check on his salt supply for the front steps. Wiping his hands on his apron, he moved to the front counter to restock the pastry bags. That's when he saw her.
Paige.
She was walking down the sidewalk, a solitary figure bundled in a thick coat, her head bowed against a wind that hadn't yet started to bite but still carried the promise of a deeper cold. Her shoulders were slumped, and even from across the street, he could see the worried tension in her posture. She looked like she was carrying the weight of the whole gray sky. Without thinking, he raised a hand to wave, a hopeful, foolish gesture. But her gaze was fixed on the worn pavement in front of her, lost in a world of thought that clearly had no room for friendly bakers waving from their windows. She didn't see him. She walked right past his line of sight and up the 2 short steps to the Reading Nook, disappearing inside. A pang of disappointment, sharper than he wanted to admit, hit him. He looked forward to her morning visits, to the brief, bright moment she'd step into his warm, flower-dusted world from her quiet, paper-scented one. He liked the way her eyes lit up when she looked at the pastry case. But more than that, he liked her smile. It was a rare thing, it seemed, but when it appeared, it transformed her whole face, chasing the shadows from her eyes. It was a shame to see her looking so sad. He knew a little of what she was up to. The whole town did. Her Christmas Around the World series was an ambitious, wonderful idea, a spark of creative energy on the quiet Main street. If he remembered correctly, today was Christmas in Germany. He hoped, with a sincerity that surprised him, that it was a success. He understood what it was to pour an entire heart and soul, and every last penny, into an idea, to send it out into the world and pray that people would show up. The scent of gingerbread pulled him back to the cooling rack. An idea, half-formed and impulsive, sparked in his mind. She was his best, most reliable customer for morning coffee. And he needed a second opinion on this new recipe. It was a perfectly legitimate business reason. But if he was being honest with himself, it was more than that. He thought about her sad downward glance and the smile he missed seeing. Maybe, just maybe, a warm muffin, a small, unexpected gift with no strings attached, could help. Maybe it could bring that smile back, even just for a minute. Decision made. He carefully plucked the best-looking muffin from the tray, one that had risen a little higher than the rest, and slipped it into a small white pastry box. It was a simple gesture, a peace offering to a gloomy morning. A small piece of the warmth and hope from his world, sent next door to hers. He set the box on the counter, next to the register, and waited. He wouldn't have to wait long. You could set a watch by her need for her morning coffee. And as he waited, he sent up another small prayer, this one not for his business or his baking, but for hers. He hoped her German Christmas was everything she needed it to be. He hoped she was crowded with customers, and that for a little while at least, she could forget whatever made her look at the ground instead of the world around her when she walked. With a shallow breath that did little to calm the frantic hummingbird in her stomach, Paige opened the worn, cloth-bound copy of Grimm's fairy tales. The book fell open to a page softened by the touch of countless hands, her mother's included. Once upon a time, she began, her voice tight on the first few words, the beginning of the poor shoemaker's story, hitting a little too close to home. She pushed past the lump in her throat, forcing herself to slip into the familiar, soothing cadence of the tale. As she read, her voice gained a practiced warmth, a storyteller's mask she'd perfected over the years. The Hendersons, their faces alight with wonder, leaned forward from their shared armchair. Captain Silas, a man who'd seen the world, listened with a gentle, nostalgic smile, his own sea-spun yarns momentarily forgotten. Even Betty paused in her relentless note-taking, her pen momentarily still on the page. The combined sense of old books, cinnamon, and the damp wool of winter coats created a fragile shelter against the worsening winter howl outside the windows. For a few precious minutes, as the elves worked their magic on the shoemaker's leather, Paige could almost forget the red letters on her bank statement and the snowdrifts pushing against the front door like a creditor. The Brothers Grimm. Captain Silas chuckled as Paige finished, his hearty laugh breaking the spell. Knew a fellow in Bavaria, claimed his great-aunt was their chambermaid. Said they got all their best stories from her eavesdropping on the local aristocracy. He winked, a twinkle in his sea-blue eyes, and the Hendersons giggled. Paige managed a genuine smile, the small, shared moment of community a balm to her frayed nerves. Well, while we might not have any magic elves to help us, she said, moving to the small table where the thermos and mugs were waiting, we have Kinder Punch, a warm, spiced fruit punch. She described the blend of apple, orange, and cherry juices, infused with cinnamon sticks, cloves, and star anise, as she poured the steaming, ruby-red liquid into thick ceramic mugs. The fragrant steam rose, a welcome offering against the insistent chill that seemed to seep through the old window frames. Just as Tom reached for a second cup, the bell over the door jingled. The sharp sound was almost startlingly cheerful against the rising moan of the wind. Adam Emerson stood framed in the doorway, a flurry of snow swirling in behind him like a living cloud. A dusting of it already clung to his dark hair and the broad shoulders of his coat. He held a small, elegantly wrapped box, and his expression was a battle between intense nervousness and resolute determination. Paige? Sorry to interrupt, he began, his breath a white puff in the store's warmth. He took a hesitant step inside, stamping the snow from his boots. I made these. He stepped forward, his gaze focused on her, bypassing the others as he held out the box. It's Fruchtbrot, a German fruit bread. I remembered you mentioned it was Christmas in Germany today, and I thought, well, maybe they would fit your theme? His earnestness was disarming. He wasn't just a baker dropping off a pastry. He was making a quiet gesture of connection and support that left Paige momentarily speechless. A warmth that had nothing to do with the spiced punch bloomed in her chest, spreading up her neck and into her cheeks. Adam, she started, her voice softer than she intended. It fits perfectly. She took the box, her fingers brushing his. For a fleeting second, The contact was a spark of warmth against her cold, trembling skin. The bread inside, visible through a small cellophane window, was dark and dense, studded with the jewel-like colors of dried cherries, apricots, and nuts. That was so incredibly thoughtful. Thank you. Betty's pen, which had been momentarily still, was now a blur across her page, documenting this unexpected development. Lily Henderson let out a soft, appreciative sigh, her gaze flicking between Paige and Adam with obvious interest. Please join us, Paige offered, gesturing to an empty armchair near the clanking radiator. I'd love to. No one is coming into the bakery during this kind of weather, he said with a shy smile, carefully removing his coat and hanging it on the antique rack. His presence seemed to fill the space in a way that was both comforting and, for Paige, strangely unsettling. He was a tangible reminder of a life outside her all-consuming bubble of worry, a life where people took chances and built new things based on hope and dreams. After the fructibrat had been passed from person to person, a chorus of delighted murmurs filled the room. The bread's rich, complex sweetness, dense with fruit and spice, was a perfect companion to the tart warmth of the punch. But as they savored the unexpected treats, the moody weather outside darkened palpably. The wind, no longer just whistling, slammed against the building in heavy, shuddering gusts, rattling the window panes in their century-old frames as if an angry giant were trying to get in. Snow, no longer drifting, drove against the glass in thick, horizontal sheets, obscuring the city street in a swirling white vortex. The world outside had vanished in a sea of white, erased by the storm. The cozy haven of the bookstore suddenly felt small and fragile, a ship tossed on a raging sea. The blue glow of his phone cast an unsettling light on Tom Henderson's face, making it appear eerie. "Whoa," he announced, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and alarm. "They've upgraded it again. This is a full-blown blizzard warning now. State police are advising everyone to stay off the roads immediately." A heavy, weighted silence fell over the small group, the comforting sounds of sipping and murmuring gone. Captain Silas stared into the white void beyond the window, his leathery face grim. "Aye," he muttered, his voice a low rumble. "This has the look of the '78 nor'easter. A proper beast, that one was." Betty, sensing a dramatic headline for the Chronicle, had a sharp glint in her eye as she watched the snowstorm bang against the windows. The strings of fairy lights overhead flickered once. A collective intake of breath sounded in the small space. They flickered again, longer this time, casting dancing shadows across the room. Paige's heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a frantic drum of fear. "Perhaps," she began, the words catching in her throat as the carefully constructed calm she'd maintained all morning finally shattered. The anxiety was no longer a knot in her stomach. It was a cold flood rising in her chest, threatening to drown her. It was a fear not just for their safety, but for the fate of her event, for the income she so desperately, achingly needed. "Perhaps we should wrap this up. If the roads are getting bad." As if on cue, the lights surged with a desperate, painful brightness, bathing everything in a harsh, unnatural glare. Then, with a soft pop, they died. The store plunged into an eerie, disorienting a collective gasp echoed in the sudden, profound silence, broken only by a furious gust of wind that made the old building groan around them. The storm wasn't coming. It was here. Chapter 4. The darkness that swallowed the Reading Nook was absolute and suffocating, a physical weight that pressed in from all sides. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the only sound was the furious, elemental shriek of the blizzard, as if the world outside were being torn apart. The clanking radiator died, and a profound cold seeped from the floorboards, a cold both from the weather and the overwhelming feeling of isolation. Only then came a sharp collective gasp out of the dark. A shaky beam of light sliced through the black as Tom activated his phone's flashlight. The sudden illumination was jarring, making the familiar shadows of bookshelves leap and dance like frightened things in the dust-filled air. "Oh, my goodness." Lily's voice was a thin, frightened squeak from somewhere in the gloom, her attempt at adventurousness completely gone. "Well, now this is a pickle," Captain Silas boomed. The usual cheer in his voice was stretched thin, a flimsy cover over a new, hard gravity. "This has the feel of the 88 blow. That one took the roof clean off the old fish cannery. Let's hope this old building has better bones." The comment, meant to be a bracing sea story, landed like a stone, only ratcheting up the tension in the cold air. Paige's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. Panic, cold and sharp as an icicle, clawed at the base of her throat. She could feel the stares of the others on her, even in the dark. "They're your customers. This is your place, your responsibility. Don't you dare fall apart." She shoved the fear down with a force that made her stomach clench. "Okay, everyone," she said, her voice strained but steady. "Let's not panic." She turned and fumbled in a drawer behind the counter, her hands clumsy and useless. "I have flashlights. And candles. Somewhere in here." Her fingers brushed against a tangle of pens, brittle rubber bands, and old, forgotten receipts before finally closing around the cool, smooth metal of a heavy-duty flashlight. "The candles are on a display rack by the door." Adam's voice cut through the rising murmur of fear. It was calm, low, and practical, an anchor in the swirling chaos. While Paige had been dealing with her own rising terror, he had already assessed the situation and started moving, his silhouette crossing Tom's flashlight beam with a sense of purpose. Paige finally clicked her own light on, its powerful beam a welcome, if eerie, path through the gloom. She located a second one and handed it to Betty, whose face was a pale, worried mask in the sudden light. By the time Paige had her bearings, Adam was already returning from the front of the store, a handful of scented candles in his grasp, ironically labeled Summer Sunshine. Paige grabbed a box of matches from the counter. Drawn by an unspoken need, they all drifted toward the front of the store, a small, huddled group peering out the windows. The world beyond the glass was an impenetrable, churning whiteout. Snow, driven by a relentless, violent wind, plastered itself against the panes with sharp pinging sounds, piling up in the sills with alarming speed. It made the sturdy old building look like it was being slowly, deliberately buried alive. Tom held his phone up, its screen the only modern light in the suddenly primitive environment. "The cell tower must be down," he announced, his voice tight with frustration. "Signal's gone." A chorus of clicks and taps followed as the others checked their own devices, their faces illuminated in brief, hopeful flashes before falling back into shadow. They were cut off, an island in a sea of white. Captain Silas, however, grunted with effort, his ancient flip phone held high as if making an offering to the storm. "Got a sliver. Hold on." He pressed the phone to his ear, shouting over a sudden, deafening gust of wind that made the whole building groan. "Angus? It's Silas. What's the word on that snowplow?" A long, crackling pause filled the store, every person holding their breath. Silas's weathered face fell, the hope draining from it. "Engines seized? No promises?"
"Got it."
He listened for a moment longer, his shoulders slumping.
"Right."
"You stay safe, old friend." He snapped the phone shut, the sound echoing with a terrible finality. "Well, folks," he announced, his voice stripped of all its earlier bluster. "Angus over at the highway department says their only plow is dead in the water. We're on our own, till this blows over." The words hung in the air, chilling them more than the drafts seeping through the floorboards.
"Trapped."
The word screamed in Paige's mind. She took a deep, shaky breath, the scent of melting wax, damp wool, fear, and old paper sharp in her nostrils. This was it. The moment she either crumbled under the weight of it all or held it together. She thought of her mother, running this store for years. Her mother had faced down leaky roofs and slow seasons, but never anything like this. The fear of the storm was nothing compared to the terror of being the one who let her mother's dream die in the dark. She wouldn't crumble. Not here. "All right," Paige said, her voice finding a surprising firmness that felt borrowed from her mother's memory. "Looks like we're having an unplanned sleepover." She managed a small smile that felt fragile and thin in the wavering candlelight. There's tea, snacks, the rest of Adam's amazing fructibrat, and of course, plenty of books. Adam gestured with a candle toward the hulking, cast-iron wood-burning furnace tucked into a brick-lined alcove. Paige, is that usable? Is the chimney clear? I think so, she said, the memory distant and hazy. My mother used it during bad winters. Said it was more reliable than the power company. There's a woodpile stacked against the back wall, outside. I'll get some wood, he stated. Grabbing his coat, he took a flashlight and disappeared through the small stockroom. A moment later, they heard the back door groan open. A deafening roar of wind and snow blasted through the store, extinguishing 2 of the candles and sending a cascade of papers fluttering from the counter. The door slammed shut, and silence returned, heavier than before. He reappeared a few minutes later, a human snowdrift, his coat and hair white, but his arms were full of dry, split logs. Without a word, he stomped the snow from his boots near the door to avoid soaking the floor, then carried the wood to the hearth. Only then did he shrug off his snow-caked coat. His quiet competence became a calming presence that seemed to actively push back against the store's rising chaos. He kneeled at the hearth, wordlessly checking the flue and carefully laying a bed of old dry kindling from a box next to the furnace. Paige found a box of long fireplace matches, her hand trembling as she struck one. The flare of sulfur was blindingly bright in the gloom. The first tiny flame touched the kindling, flickered, and died. Her heart sank with it. She took another breath and struck a second match. This time, a stubborn little flame caught, wavered, and then grew, licking at the wood and casting dancing orange shadows that felt like the purest form of hope. As the fire began to crackle and spit, chasing the worst of the cold from the center of the room, the group's initial, sharp fear gave way to a weary sense of resignation. Paige unearthed a pile of old, soft blankets she kept in a cedar chest for customers who liked to curl up and read. It's like indoor camping, Lily declared, her youthful sense of adventure cautiously returning now that the fire was lit. That old armchair will do me fine, lass, Captain Silas announced, settling his large frame back into his favorite chair. Slept in worse places, believe you me. This is luxury. Betty Higgins, ever the journalist, had positioned herself near the fire, her notebook still open on her lap, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Paige and Adam, having distributed the blankets, stood together near the slowly warming furnace. The firelight softened the hard lines of worry on his face and found flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Their own eyes met over the flickering flames. In his eyes, she didn't see panic, but a steady calm that seemed to quiet the storm inside her own chest. For the first time all day, she felt she wasn't entirely alone in this fight. The storm raged on, a wild beast trying to claw its way in, but inside the candlelit, fire-warmed bookstore, she felt a fragile, quiet connection forming with the baker. Chapter 5. The small flame in the old furnace caught hold of a larger piece of seasoned pine with a satisfying crackle, a sound of loud defiance against the storm's windy roar. Adam watched, feeling a primal sense of satisfaction as the fire grew, its hungry orange tongues leaping up from the dry wood. He had brought light and warmth into the encroaching cold and dark, a tangible contribution that eased a tension in his own chest he hadn't realized he was holding. The warm, smoky scent that permeated the air was a comforting, earthy perfume, and it felt like a victory as it pushed back the damp, seeping cold that had claimed the room. The shadows, which had been sharp and menacing in the flashlight beams, softened and danced on the towering bookshelves, and the entire room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. He felt the others draw closer, their faces illuminated by the growing glow. "Thank you, Adam," Paige said, her voice soft with a gratitude that seemed to go far beyond the fire. The genuine warmth in her tone hit him more directly than the heat from the furnace. He met her gaze across the hearth, the flames reflecting in her dark eyes like twin captured stars. "I truly don't know what we'd do without that wood." A faint flush rose on his cheeks, and he ducked his head, suddenly feeling awkward under the weight of her praise. "Just glad the old thing works," he mumbled, turning his attention back to the fire. It was easier to focus on practical things. Instead of placing another log flat on the flames, he expertly angled it against the first, creating a channel for the air to flow. He could feel her watching him, and he hoped the quiet competence of the action spoke for him, conveying what he couldn't quite put into words. With the immediate crisis averted, a strange, almost surreal sense of calm settled over them. When Paige suggested the captain continue his story, Adam settled into an armchair, ready to listen. The old sailor's voice was a rich, resonant anchor against the storm, and for a while, Adam was transported with the others to a different sea, a different storm, long ago. But as the tale of the 73 typhoon wound on, his attention kept drifting back to Paige. Wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the storyteller, yet he saw the subtle, intermittent shiver that ran through her, the way she discreetly rubbed her arms for warmth. The furnace was a beacon, but it couldn't fight all the drafts in the vast, high-ceilinged room. She was still cold. The thought lodged in his mind, a problem in need of a solution. And then it hit him. Hot chocolate. Real hot chocolate, made with the good Dutch cocoa and whole milk he had sitting in the bakery. He waited for a comfortable silence to fall as the captain's story wound down, then leaned forward slightly, pitching his voice low so only she could hear.
"Paige," he said.
"I have everything for hot chocolate back at the bakery. Good Dutch cocoa, whole milk, marshmallows, the works." He glanced toward his front door, now just a vague outline behind a thick curtain of wind-driven snow. "It's only 20 feet. I think I can make a run for it." He saw the immediate alarm in her wide eyes. "You wouldn't be able to see your hand in front of your face." The fear in her voice was for him, he realized, and the thought sent a strange warmth through him. "I'll be careful," he insisted gently, meeting her gaze with what he hoped was a reassuring steadiness. "I can keep one hand on the wall of the building the whole way. It would be nice. It will help keep you and the others warm." He said others, but it was the thought of her, warmed from the inside out by something he had provided, that spurred him on. When she finally agreed, her whispered, "Okay," a mix of surrender and fear, he felt a surge of quiet determination. She found him a thick woolen blanket, and he wrapped it around his shoulders like a cloak, giving her a single, reassuring nod before pulling the bookstore door open. The storm scream was a physical assault. The wind tore the air from his lungs and slammed into him with the force of a solid object. He plunged into a world of churning, blinding white, instantly disoriented. He slammed the door shut behind him and pressed his back against the building, the cold brick of vital anchor. Hand over hand, keeping constant contact with the wall, he shuffled through the deepening drift, his boots sinking to his shins. The 20 feet felt like a mile. The wind shrieked in his ears, and ice crystals stung his exposed cheeks. For a terrifying second, his hand slipped, and he lost contact with the wall, his heart lurching into his throat. He flailed, found it again, and pushed onward, focused only on the goal. He practically fell through his own bakery door, the familiar scent of yeast and sugar a welcome shock after the sterile fury outside. He didn't waste a second, grabbing the milk, cocoa, marshmallows, and a box, his hands clumsy with cold. Then, he plunged back into the maelstrom for the return journey. When he finally stumbled back into the Reading Nook, the collective cheer that erupted was raw with relief. He slammed the door shut, leaning against it for a moment, his breath coming in ragged, steaming puffs. He was caked in white from head to toe, his eyelashes frosted over, but he clutched the cardboard box to his chest like a trophy, a grin of pure triumph spreading across his face. "Made it," he managed to say through his cold, stiff lips. He kneeled by the furnace to brush the clinging snow from the box, and Paige kneeled beside him, their shoulders almost touching in the small circle of firelight. A comfortable silence settled between them as they worked. He carefully poured the milk into the old enamel pot she'd found, his hands surprisingly steady despite the cold, while she added generous spoonfuls of the dark, fragrant cocoa powder. He took the wooden spoon he'd brought back and stirred, the rich aroma of warming chocolate rising to mingle with the wood smoke, creating a perfume of pure, unadulterated comfort. In that quiet, shared task, he felt a connection to her that was deeper than any conversation they'd had. He filled the mugs, topping each with a generous handful of marshmallows. As he handed Paige hers, his fingers brushed against her knuckles. The warmth of his skin against her icy ones was a startling jolt, a current that seemed to travel right up his arm. He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes that mirrored his own. The simple act of sharing this drink, brewed together in the heart of a blizzard, felt deeply significant. It was a sweet, chocolatey truce with the wildness outside, a minor victory that bound them, and especially the two of them, together in the flickering, firelit haven of the Reading Nook. Chapter 6. The evening deepened, drawing long, flickering shadows from the now robustly burning furnace that stretched across the floorboards. Outside, the blizzard maintained its relentless assault, a constant, furious roar that seemed to physically press in on the small bookstore, making their sanctuary feel like the last quiet, sane corner of a world gone mad. The sharp adrenaline of the initial crisis had long since faded, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness that settled into their muscles and quieted their minds. The Hendersons, after a final whisper debate over the strategic placement of cushions, had succumbed to sleep, their youthful energy finally spent. Captain Silas snored softly in his wingback, a rhythmic, rumbling sound that was strangely comforting, a human bass line to the storm's chaotic symphony. Even Betty, ever the vigilant observer, seemed to doze, her head tilted at an angle, her notebook resting precariously on her lap, though her fingers were still curled tightly around her pen, as if ready to take notes even in her dreams. In the circle of warmth, Paige and Adam moved in a quiet, unspoken rhythm, collecting the empty mugs and brushing away stray crumbs. The easy, group-oriented conversation of earlier had settled into a comfortable, more intimate silence between the two of them, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the ceaseless howl of the wind. It was a silence that wasn't empty, but full of the unspoken events of the day. "I still can't believe this is happening," Paige murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper, so as not to wake the others. She stared into the hypnotic dance of the flames, the orange light reflecting in her tired eyes. "It feels like a dream." "I know," Adam replied, his voice a low counterpoint to the storm. He carefully added a small log to the fire. "Definitely not how I picture my first Christmas season in Snowdrift Cove." A small, wry smile touched his lips. "Though I suppose it's memorable." "Memorable is one word for it," she agreed, a faint, genuine smile mirroring his. The shared moment of understated humor, small as it was, felt like a lifeline in the surreal quiet. From her armchair, a voice, startlingly clear and dry, cut through the space. "A body can't help but notice," Betty Higgins said, without opening her eyes, "how one person's crisis is another's opportunity. Fortunes are made, and many have their lives changed in storms like this." Her voice was musing, almost philosophical, yet Paige felt the words land with the pointed accuracy of a well-aimed dart, intended for an audience of two. A hot, mortifying blush crept up Paige's neck, and she suddenly found the intricate pattern of the braided rug at her feet the most fascinating thing she had ever seen. Beside her, Adam cleared his throat, a small, awkward sound, and busied himself unnecessarily with the poker, nudging a log that was already perfectly placed. The comfortable silence of moments before was gone. Later, when the fire had burned down to a deep, pulsating bed of glowing embers, the quiet returned, but it was different now, imbued with a new feeling of connection. The captain's snores were a steady rhythm, a sign that the world, in some small way, was still turning. "This store," Paige began, the words coming out in a rush before she truly decided to speak them, propelled by the strange, confessional intimacy of the late hour. "It was my mother's dream. Not just a business, but her entire world. She used to say that every book had a soul, and that a bookstore was a sanctuary for them." She gestured vaguely at the shadowy shelves, which seemed to hold more than just paper and ink in the dim light. "After she passed, keeping it going felt, essential. If the store survived, a part of her would too. It's all I have left of her, really. She paused, tracing the rim of her empty mug, her nail catching on a small chip in the ceramic. The next words were even quieter, heavy with a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to show anyone. It hasn't been easy lately. The bills, they don't care about dreams. This Christmas Around the World event, it's my last real shot to turn things around. The unspoken words, before I lose everything she built, hung between them in the firelit air, as real and as heavy as the snow piling up outside. Adam didn't offer the hollow platitudes or easy reassurances she'd expected. He simply listened, his entire attention focused on her, his stillness creating a safe harbor where her confession didn't feel like a weakness, but simply like the truth. When she finally dared to look at him, his expression was soft with an empathy that felt like a warm blanket wrapping around her chilled spirit. "Anyone who walks in here can feel that, Paige," he said, his voice gentle but sure. "It isn't just a shop. It's a place with a heart. What you're doing, keeping that heart beating, that's a beautiful, brave thing. Your mother would be so proud." The simple, sincere words landed in the center of her fear and exhaustion, a balm she didn't know she so desperately needed. A tear she hadn't realized was forming pricked at the corner of her eye, and she quickly blinked it away. Encouraged by her openness, and perhaps by the anonymity granted by the storm, Adam's own defenses seemed to lower. "I get it, in a way," he said, his gaze fixed on the glowing coals as if seeing his own past smoldering there. "I used to work in finance back in Portland. Good money, a corner office in a tall building, and I was miserable. Genuinely miserable. I felt like I was disappearing piece by piece every day, turning into a spreadsheet." He looked up, and the firelight caught a different, more passionate gleam in his eyes. "Baking was the only thing that felt real, the only time I felt like myself. Moving here, sinking every penny I had into the sweet spot, it was the scariest, most reckless thing I've ever done. Still is most days." In the stillness of the night, they spoke quietly, sharing their individual stories. They spoke of the quiet terror of staring at a stack of unpaid invoices and the unexpected joy of a child's wide-eyed wonder at a pastry case. They talked about the loneliness of being your own boss and the profound satisfaction of creating something with your own two hands, something that brought a small measure of warmth or happiness into someone else's day. "It takes incredible courage to walk away from a job to start over from scratch," Paige said, seeing him now not just as the kind baker from next door, but as a fellow traveler on the same difficult, uncertain, and hopeful road. Adam met her gaze, with a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "No more than it takes to continue a legacy," he said softly. "You're fighting for something every day." And there, in the heart of the blizzard, surrounded by the sleeping town and the ghosts of their separate dreams, a fragile, vital thread of understanding wove itself between them, a connection forged in the quiet honesty of the storm. Chapter 7. The middle of the night found Adam suspended in a strange limbo, caught between exhaustion and a mind that refused to quiet. He sat in an armchair near the hearth, a dark, broad-shouldered silhouette against the orange glow of the embers. Outside, the wind still howled its mournful, relentless song, but inside, the furnace crackled, a warm and steady heartbeat in the otherwise silent store. He listened to the soft snores of the others, a strangely comforting sound in the communal dark. He couldn't sleep. His thoughts kept circling back to Paige, to the weight she was so clearly carrying on her shoulders. He saw a shadow move near the furnace and realized it was her. She couldn't find rest either. He watched as she slipped quietly from her armchair, her stockinged feet silent on the old floorboards. There was a restless energy about her, a need to do something. She checked the furnace, adding a log. The simple, physical task a welcome distraction. She was so determined to hold everything together, to be the calm center of this storm for everyone else. As she peered through a small, clear patch on the window at the swirling chaos, he felt a sudden urge to break the heavy silence, to let her know she wasn't the only one awake in the belly of the beast. "Can't sleep either?" His voice was low, and he instantly worried he'd startled her when she jumped with a small gasp. "No," she admitted, her voice a whisper. "Too much, everything, I guess." He nodded, though she could probably barely see the gesture in the shadows. "It's a lot to process." He felt a complete, simple understanding of her words. His own mind was a chaotic replay of dwindling savings, the unexpected hope of holiday orders, and the ever-present weight of his own gamble on this new life. They fell into a quiet, easy conversation, their voices hushed against the backdrop of the storm, creating their own small island of wakefulness. He wanted to draw her out, to see past the worried bookstore owner to the person underneath. She told him about a disastrous childhood Christmas pageant, and he could almost picture her as a little girl with stage fright, bleeding the wrong lines. The story was so endearing it made him smile in the dark. He countered with a harrowing tale of a 5-tiered wedding cake that nearly slid off its pedestal, a memory that was terrifying at the time but funny in retrospect. It felt good to share it, to trade these small, inconsequential pieces of themselves. In the shared solitude of the deep night, stripped of all pretense by the storm, he felt a deeper, more intricate connection weaving itself between them. Just as a comfortable, warm silence settled, a sudden, violent wind burst hit the bookstore with the force of a physical blow. The building groaned, a deep, timber-straining sound of protest. The sound was immediately followed by a sharp, sickening crack that ripped through the night, loud and definitive as a firecracker. Adrenaline shot through him, cold and immediate. The sound jolted everyone awake. He heard Lily's terrified scream and saw Captain Silas leap to his feet. The front window. Paige's voice was sharp with a fear that pierced straight through him. He was already moving, his earlier quietness replaced by an urgent, protective energy. He grabbed his flashlight, clicking it on as he raced to the front of the store, Paige a half step behind him, their beams cutting urgent, bobbing paths through the darkness. They saw it instantly, a jagged, spiderwebbing fracture blooming across the large display window. The wind whistled through a new, prominent crack, a high-pitched, piercing sound, carrying a fine, icy mist of snow that was already dusting a display of classic novels. "Oh, no," Paige breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. He saw the pure horror on her face, the waking nightmare of seeing this place breached by the storm. "We have to cover it," he said, his voice urgent but steady, forcing a calm he didn't entirely feel. "It needs to be reinforced. Now." They worked with desperate, focused energy that left no room for thought. While Paige ran to the back room, his mind raced. He pressed his back against the flexing, vibrating glass, using his body as a brace, trying to stabilize it against the next powerful gust. The cold seeped through his clothes instantly. When she returned with cardboard and a roll of duct tape, they moved in a close, automatic choreography born of pure necessity. Their hands touched, their shoulders bumped. He was intensely aware of her beside him, of their shared purpose, to protect this place and its books. He tore off long strips of tape, while she held the cardboard, their breath misting in the cold air pouring from the fracture. Finally, the whistling was silenced. They stepped back, adrenaline singing in their veins. "Good work, you two," Captain Silas declared. "Stout hearts. That should hold her, till morning." The adrenaline ebbed as quickly as it had surged, leaving a bone-deep tremor in its wake. He watched Paige move as if in a daze to make tea, her hands shaking so badly she could barely pour the hot water. Later, after the others had settled back into a restless quiet, they stood together near the patched, wounded window. The silence felt different now, heavier. "If that window had broken," Paige began, and her voice trembled, the last of her carefully constructed composure finally dissolving. "All these books, they're not just inventory. They're all I have left of her, Adam." The dam she'd held inside herself for so long finally broke. Tears welled and spilled over, tracing hot paths down her cold cheeks. "It's my mother. If I lose this place, I don't just lose a business. I lose her. All over again." The raw, Ragged grief in her voice was the sound of a heart breaking wide open, and his own heart ached in response. He stood beside her, a silent, steadfast presence, letting her grief have the space it needed. He understood. This wasn't about a building, it was about a person. It was about memory and love, and the terror of letting it all slip away. After a long moment, he gently, tentatively, placed a hand on her arm. "We won't let that happen, Paige," he said softly. The words came from a place of quiet conviction he didn't know he possessed. It wasn't a platitude. It was a promise. A promise he had every intention of keeping. She leaned into his touch, just for a second, drawing a sliver of strength from his certainty. And the word we echoed in the quiet space, no longer just a word, but a small, sturdy shelter he had built for both of them against the fury outside. Chapter 8. The chamomile tea and sheer exhaustion had finally lulled most of the group back into a restless, shallow sleep. The wind's fury had softened to a grumble, a constant reminder of their isolation. Inside, the profound quiet was a physical presence, broken only by the soft hiss and crackle of the furnace. Paige, bone-weary but with a mind too wired to rest, had found an old, leather-bound photo album tucked away on a bottom shelf, its cover worn smooth by her mother's hands. She sat on the braided rug near the furnace, its warmth a welcome comfort seeping into her chilled bones, and slowly turned the stiff, black pages of memories. Pictures of a younger, vibrant version of her mother stared back at her, her smile so familiar it brought a bittersweet ache to Paige's chest. There she was, laughing, at the store's grand opening. There she was again, years later, surrounded by a circle of captivated young faces during a Christmas story hour. Paige traced the faded image of her mother's hand resting on a child's head, a phantom touch across time. It felt like only yesterday and a lifetime ago. Adam, who had been quietly observing her from his armchair, rose with a quiet grace that didn't disturb the sleeping room and came to sit on the rug near her. He didn't crowd her, leaving a respectful space between them, but his presence was a comforting warmth in the chill air, a silent offer of companionship. He watched her turn a page, his gaze soft. "What you said earlier," Adam began, his voice low and gentle, careful not to break the fragile peace of the moment. "About this place and your mother, I understand." He paused, searching for the right words, his gaze thoughtful. "My bakery, it's not just about the profit or even just about the baking. It's about creating something that matters." He looked around the shadowy, book-lined room, a space so full of history and love. "My old life, it was all numbers on a screen. Targets, bottom lines. I realized one day I was spending my life helping rich people get richer, and it just felt hollow. Utterly empty." He looked at her then, his usual shyness momentarily burned away by the confessional quiet of the night. "Your bookstore isn't empty, Paige. Anyone who walks in here can feel that. It has a soul, and I really admire how welcoming you've been to me, a newcomer who isn't always the most outgoing person." The sincerity in his voice was a balm. Paige felt her own cheeks warm in response. "Thank you, Adam. That means more than you know." She traced the outline of a smiling child in one of the photographs, a child who would be a teenager by now. "I always wanted the Reading Nook to be a place where people could escape, you know? Find new worlds, live 1,000 different lives, maybe feel a little less alone for a few hours. And I want the sweet spot to be where anyone can come for a little bit of tasty joy," Adam added, his voice resonating with a quiet passion that mirrored her own. "A small measure of comfort on a hard day. A place where the biggest decision you have to make is chocolate or vanilla." They looked at each other then, and in the soft, flickering light, a profound sense of understanding passed between them, a feeling that went deeper than words. They were different, Paige with her stories and Adam with his spices, but at the heart of it all, their dreams were the same: to create small, warm spaces of solace and welcome in their small corner of the world. The fire in the furnace had burned low, the orange glow dimming to a soft pulse. The air grew cooler. "Needs more wood," Paige murmured, the practical need breaking the spell. She made to get up, her muscles stiff from sitting on the floor. "I'll get it," Adam said, rising smoothly in one motion. He reached for a log from the small pile they'd brought inside, just as Paige, thinking the same thing, did. Their hands brushed. His was warm and solid against the coolness of her own, the texture of his calluses against the smoothness of her skin. The fleeting contact wasn't accidental, not entirely. A jolt, sharp and undeniable, shot up Paige's arm, stealing the breath from her lungs. This time, the contact lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary. They both looked up, their eyes meeting in the dim, firelit space. The air around them seemed to still, to crackle and hum with an unspoken energy that was suddenly more powerful than the storm outside. The distant moan of the wind, the rhythmic snores of Captain Silas, even the frantic, hopeful drumming of Paige's own heart seemed to fade into the background. It was a moment of pure connection, a silent question hanging in the charged space between them. She saw her own surprise, her own dawning wonder, reflected in his dark eyes. Adam's lips parted slightly, and Paige felt her own lips curve in an answering, involuntary smile. The space between them shrank, and for a dizzying second, she thought he might lean in closer. "You know," a voice drawled from the depths of an armchair, dry as old paper and sharp as a needle, shattering the moment like glass, "if you two ever combined forces, a bookstore with an in-house bakery cafe, now that would be the heart of Snowdrift Cove." Betty Higgins's eyes remained closed, her breathing perfectly even. Only the faintest twitch of a knowing smile at the corner of her mouth betrayed that she was, and had been, awake all along. Just a thought from an old woman who's seen what makes a town tick. Paige and Adam jerked their hands back as if burned, scrambling apart. A fiery blush spread across their faces, hot enough to rival the furnace. The intimate spell didn't just break, it shattered into 100 shards of embarrassment. They exchanged a single wide-eyed glance of pure comical horror. But beneath the overwhelming wave of mortification, as she stared into the embers, Paige felt a tiny, irrepressible flicker of something else, a hopeful, intriguing, and altogether new kind of warmth. Chapter 9. A profound, almost startling silence woke Paige. The relentless howl of the wind, the percussive rattling, the deep groans of the old building, the soundtrack to their confinement for what felt like an eternity, were gone. In its place was a stillness, so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath, a quiet she hadn't realized she'd missed. She sat up, her muscles protesting with a collective ache, and saw a soft light filtering through the front of the store, painting the dusty air in pale, hopeful strokes. Careful not to disturb the others, who were still collapsed in various states of slumber, she tiptoed to the front door. What she saw through a small, clear patch of glass made her gasp, a hand flying to her lips. The storm had passed, and Snowdrift Cove had been transformed. Covered by a deep, unspoiled layer of snow, the town became hidden, while the snow itself caught the light and gleamed in the early morning. Every tree branch was laden with a heavy, perfect layer of white. Every rooftop softened into a gentle curve. The entire landscape was sculpted into breathtaking, undulating drifts, a soft, silent, white ocean, with the tops of fence posts peeking through like the buoys of a hidden world. The sky above was a clear, peaceful, impossible blue, washed clean by the tempest. "Adam," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. She turned to where he lay in his armchair, his dark hair tousled against a cushion. "Adam, wake up. You have to see this." He stirred, blinking sleepily, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. He rose without a word, his movements still stiff with sleep, and joined her at the glass. They stood side by side, their shoulders almost touching, gazing out at the transformed world. A shared sense of awe, of witnessing something truly magical and new, settled over them in the quiet. The raw, violent fury of the blizzard had given way to an almost sacred beauty. "Incredible," Adam breathed, his voice hushed with wonder. The spell was broken by a loud, rumbling snore from Captain Silas, a comical sound that made them both jump and then share a suppressed smile. The practical reality of their situation, though less immediately perilous, reasserted itself. They were still snowed in, trapped by the very beauty they were admiring. "Right," Paige said, but her voice was full of a newfound lightness, the heavy weight of the last day miraculously lifted. "Breakfast." She returned from the storeroom with a box of elegant French truffles she'd ordered for her next, now-cancelled event. She held it up with a grin. "Hungry?" As the others slowly woke, drawn by the unusual silence and the aroma of hot tea, a cheerful, almost festive mood took hold. The Hendersons debated the merits of chocolate truffles for breakfast with a comical seriousness that ended with Tom declaring it a once-in-a-blizzard opportunity. Captain Silas, after a dramatic stretch, declared that a hot cup of tea was just the ticket to clear the barnacles from a man's throat. Later that morning, as the cool winter sunshine streamed more strongly through the windows, casting long shadows across the snow, Paige saw Adam in a new light. She watched from her stool behind the register as he sat patiently with Captain Silas, who, restless now that the danger had passed, was trying to recall a complex nautical knot. The old captain's fingers fumbled with a piece of twine, his brow furrowed in frustration. Adam didn't hover or correct. He simply listened, asking thoughtful questions about hitches and bowlines, his genuine interest a quiet act of respect that visibly pleased the old sailor. A little later, when the Hendersons decided to build a more ambitious, indoor snowman, he joined in their silliness. He chuckled and helped them make their creation of cushions and blankets more structurally sound, even finding a couple of large, mismatched buttons from Paige's emergency sewing kit for eyes. It wasn't just that he was kind or patient. It was the way his quiet steadiness seemed to calm the frantic energy in her own chest. She watched him laugh, a genuine, easy sound, and felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the furnace. It was a feeling of safety, of admiration, and something else, something that made her heart beat a little faster. After a successful, arduous expedition through the deep snow to his truck for granola bars and frozen bottled water, a new ease settled between Paige and Adam. The shared ordeal, the late-night confessions, the moments of crisis faced together, had forged a bond that surpassed polite neighborliness. They moved around each other in the confined space with a comfortable, unthinking familiarity, their shared smiles holding a new depth of meaning and memory. Paige, looking at the now-empty box of French truffles, sighed with dramatic flair. "Well, I'm afraid Christmas in France might be a bit Spartan this year." Adam grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made her stomach do a little flip. "Next time," he said, his gaze holding hers, his voice soft but clear, "I'll make sure you have fresh croissants to go with them." The words were simple, but the promise of a next time, a future that extended beyond this storm, hung in the air between them, charged and full of unspoken possibility. The afternoon brought a growing restlessness among the group, a palpable eagerness for the distant, promising sound of a snowplow. Finally, as the sun dipped lower, Adam turned to Paige. He squared his shoulders, a newfound confidence in his stance, though a hint of his usual blush still colored his cheeks. "Paige," he began, his voice clear and steady, capturing the attention of the whole room. "I've been thinking. This Christmas around the world idea of yours is brilliant. Truly." He took a deep breath, his gaze earnest. "What if Betty was onto something? What if the Sweet Spot partnered with a Reading Nook? I could create themed treats for all your events. Not just for Christmas, but anything you dream up." His eyes lit up with a passionate, creative enthusiasm that was captivating. Imagine fresh scones with thickened cream and jam for a British Literature Week, or authentic biscotti for an Italian author showcase. We could have gingerbread workshops for kids in December. Paige stared at him, her heart giving a powerful, hopeful leap. The financial storm that had been raging inside her for months, a constant, oppressive weight, finally broke. In its place, a dazzling sunbeam of hope shone through. For the first time in months, the tight, persistent knot of anxiety in her stomach didn't just loosen. It dissolved completely. The weight on her shoulders, the one she carried from her mother's legacy, suddenly felt less like a burden and more like a shared dream. "Adam," she breathed, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't hide. "That would be amazing." "Absolutely amazing." They immediately began to brainstorm, the energy between them electric, their voices overlapping with excitement as ideas tumbled out one after another. "We could do a mystery theme with death by chocolate cupcakes," Paige exclaimed. "And a sci-fi week with galaxy swirl cookies," Adam added, laughing. The Hendersons listened in, thrilled by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "Wow, that's awesome," Tom exclaimed. "A bookstore and a bakery? Together? You'll need a proper online presence for that. I could help you set up an Instagram and a Facebook page." With a wink he added, "I'll work for cookies." Captain Silas nodded his gruff approval, a rare, broad smile cracking his weathered face. "Aye," he rumbled. "That's a true venture. This town needs a center like that." Even Betty Higgins, her notebook now firmly back in hand, was smiling, a genuine, non-speculative smile. The air in the Reading Nook, despite their continued confinement, suddenly felt charged with hope and the sweet, intoxicating promise of a new beginning. Chapter 10. The late afternoon sun cast long blue shadows across the snow-covered landscape of Snowdrift Cove. Inside the Reading Nook, the initial euphoria of Adam's business proposal had settled into a warm, hopeful buzz. Paige and Adam were huddled over a napkin, excitedly sketching out ideas for literary-themed treats, their voices animated and overlapping. Tom Henderson was enthusiastically outlining a multi-page website design, occasionally interrupted by Lily with suggestions for aesthetics. It started as a vibration, a low thrum that vibrated up from the floorboards, silencing their chatter one by one. Then came the sound, distant at first, a low, mechanical rumble that grew steadily louder, more insistent. Everyone fell silent, heads cocked, listening. The rumble intensified, accompanied now by the distinct, high-pitched beeping of a vehicle backing up, and then, unmistakably, the grinding, scraping sound of a heavy blade on ice-crusted pavement. Bright yellow flashing lights, brilliant even against the white snow and blue sky, pulsed through the patched-up front window, strobing across the room and their upturned faces. Captain Silas was the first to the door, his movements surprisingly agile. He peered through a clear patch of glass, his weathered face breaking into a wide, triumphant grin. "By thunder," he roared, his voice filled with a jubilant relief that echoed through the small store. "It's a plow. And a big one at that. Looks like they got the state rig through. They're clearing the main road." A collective cheer erupted in the bookstore, a joyous, unrestrained sound of pure relief. They were going home. The Hendersons hugged each other, laughing, then impulsively hugged Paige and a slightly startled Adam. But amidst the sudden elation, as the reality of freedom dawned, Paige felt a surprising pang, a sharp, piercing touch of bittersweetness. This fragile bubble, where they were all just survivors together, was about to burst. And the quiet connection she'd found with Adam, would it survive in the bright, cold light of the real world? She caught Adam's eye across the room and saw in his gaze a similar, complex emotion, relief mingled with a hint of loss. "Well," Paige said, her voice a little thick as she cleared her throat, "before we're all officially rescued and scattered to the winds, how about one last stop on our tour? How about Christmas in Maine?" She moved to a shelf dedicated to local authors and pulled down a slim, well-loved volume of New England Christmas stories. They gathered around the furnace one last time, their mood a mixture of joyful anticipation and a quiet, shared nostalgia for the ordeal they had just survived. Paige read a short, poignant story about a lighthouse keeper's Christmas, her voice clear and warm, filling the space with a sense of place, of home. The atmosphere was filled with a comfortable camaraderie, the easy, unspoken fellowship of those who have weathered a storm together and come out changed on the other side. Soon, the sounds from outside grew louder, more distinct. Voices called out, the joyful shouts of neighbors emerging from their homes, the delighted laughter of children discovering the transformed, snow-piled world. The plow had cleared a path down their street, and the town was slowly, cautiously, coming back to life. One by one, their temporary family departed. The Hendersons were effusive in their thanks, promising to be regulars at both the bookstore and the bakery. "We'll have a draft of the website for you by Christmas Eve," Tom promised. Betty gave Paige a surprisingly warm, papery hug. "You write your own story now, dear," she said with a knowing wink, her eyes crinkling. "And make it a good one. The best stories are always about new beginnings." Captain Silas shook Adam's hand firmly. "Good man," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "You handled yourself well, son. Both of you did." He gave Paige a paternal pat on the shoulder. "This old town needs more young folk with your spirit." Finally, it was just Paige and Adam left in the beautifully chaotic, snow-dusted bookstore. The sounds of the waking town drifted in the cold air. Cheerful greetings, the crunch of boots on fresh snow, the squeals of children during a snowball fight. The air was crisp and cold, smelling of wood smoke and the clean, sharp scent of winter. They stood amidst the scattered blankets, the empty mugs, the lingering scent of chocolate and old books, a place that now held so many new, indelible memories. I can't thank you enough, Adam," Paige said softly, turning to him. The firelight and the last rays of the setting sun painted his face in warm hues. "For everything. The fire, the hot chocolate, the window, for just being here." "We got through it together, Paige," he replied, his voice equally soft. He took a step closer. "And for what it's worth, I wouldn't have wanted to be snowed in with anyone else." A shy smile touched her lips. "Me neither." He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray snowflake from her hair. The simple, tender touch was the final nudge she needed. The last of her reserve crumbled. Before she could second-guess it, propelled by the relief, the gratitude, and the dazzling realization that she didn't want this to end, Paige closed the space between them and hugged him tightly. He stiffened in surprise for a split second, then his arms came around her, holding her close in a hug filled with the warmth of a connection forged in the heart of a storm. When they finally pulled back slightly, the unspoken feelings, the undeniable spark that had been crackling between them, were too strong to ignore. The world outside, with its plows and neighbors and the return to normalcy, seemed to fade away. There were only the two of them, standing in the glow of her beloved bookstore. He leaned in, his gaze searching hers, and she met him halfway. The kiss was tentative at first, a soft question asked in the aftermath of a storm. Then it deepened, full of the shared relief, the quiet confessions, and the burgeoning hope that had grown between them in the dark. It was a kiss that tasted of comfort and possibility, the sweet, undeniable promise of a new beginning. When they finally broke apart, Paige rested her head against his chest and looked around the Reading Nook. It was still her mother's legacy, still her sanctuary, but now it was something more. It was a place where unexpected magic had happened. The future, which had seemed so daunting just a few days ago, now felt bright, filled with possibilities, not just for her bookstore, but for her heart. The blizzard had brought more than just snow to Snowdrift Cove. It had brought a sweet, unexpected, and utterly wonderful new beginning.